The war was supposed to be about bullets, strategy, and courage. But here, in the endless yellow sea of sand, it was heat that killed faster than the enemy. The desert didn't roar with gunfire that day. It hissed, whispering through dunes as tanks stood silent, their metal skin too hot to touch. American machines, fresh from Detroit's proud factories, were dying under the sun before the Germans even saw them. Engines that had once thundered through training grounds back home now groaned like beasts gasping for air. The temperature inside a Sherman tank climbed past 140 degrees. Oil boiled, fuel evaporated, and men fainted before they even fired a shot. The enemy wasn't Rommel's Afrika Korps, it was the desert itself. Commanders tried to stay calm, shouting orders over the crackling radio static, but their voices carried frustration more than authority. In the middle of a battle, tanks stalled in perfect firing range, their treads half buried in sand. Crews scrambled out, dragging their half-conscious gunners, collapsing behind armor that felt like an oven wall. Some never got back up. By the second week of the campaign, dozens of tanks sat abandoned across the dunes, monuments of American engineering turned into metal coffins. Mechanics worked around the clock, wiping sweat and sand from their faces, pulling apart engines that looked perfectly fine until they simply refused to live. Nobody could explain it. The Army's best engineers sent messages back home. Equipment malfunction. Possibly fuel quality. But deep down, the men in the desert knew this wasn't about bad fuel. It was something deeper. Something built into the very lungs of the machine. The desert was suffocating them, and their tanks were suffocating themselves. Each morning began with a thin hope that maybe this time, the engines would hold. By noon, the hope melted along with the radiator water. Soldiers poured sand over the hoods, thinking it might somehow block the heat. Others stripped off armor panels, risking shrapnel, just to give the engines more air. Every improvised act broke regulations. But when survival is at stake, rules are just words. A sergeant named Dwyer summed it up in his journal. We fight the heat before we fight the enemy. The sun's the only one winning. The days blurred together. Endless glare, the smell of burning oil, the sharp taste of sand on every breath. At night, the desert turned cold, but the tanks still radiated the day's torture. Some mechanics slept against their machines, afraid they wouldn't start again if left alone. Back in Washington, reports called it temporary performance issues. But out here, it was more than performance, it was survival. Every broken tank meant a crew stranded miles from water, waiting to be found by either side. And yet, amid all this chaos, one man refused to accept defeat. He wasn't a commander, or an engineer with a degree. He was just a mechanic, Private Raymond Carter, 24 years old, from a small garage in Kansas. Quiet, stubborn, the kind of man who listened more than he talked. He'd grown up fixing tractors in summers that felt just as hot as this desert. Carter had noticed something others missed. Each time a tank overheated, he opened the engine bay and watched. He didn't just see parts, he saw how air moved, or failed to move. He watched the flow of dust, how it circled back into the vents instead of escaping. It wasn't just the desert choking the tanks. The tanks were choking themselves. While others blamed the sun, Carter began sketching diagrams in the dirt. Lines showing air entering, heat trapped, airflow folding back into itself. The design was all wrong for the desert. The Shermans had been built for Europe, for damp forests and cold mornings. Here, the same design turned deadly. But when he mentioned it, the officers brushed him off. You're a mechanic, not an engineer, they said. Stick to repairs, not redesigns. So he did what soldiers in every hopeless war have done. He pretended to follow orders and quietly prepared to break them. Every evening, as the camp settled, Carter stayed behind, watching how the wind moved through wrecked tanks. He saw how heat rose through armor gaps, how the fans pushed hot air back toward the engine instead of away. He began to imagine something impossible. What if the airflow could be reversed? What if the tanks could breathe differently? But that idea wasn't just crazy, it was forbidden. Military design wasn't to be touched. Every nut, every bolt, had passed through inspection lines, stamped with official seals. Altering any of it without authorization could mean court-martial. Still, Carter couldn't shake the image from his mind. The sound of boiling engines haunted him. The sight of men passing out under the guns of their own tanks gnawed at him. Rules suddenly felt meaningless compared to that. One night, as he walked through rows of silent machines gleaming under moonlight, he ran his hand along the metal. It felt like the body of something still alive, waiting for someone to save it. The war had given birth to machines, but machines needed to breathe like men, and right now, they were suffocating. The next morning, another Sherman broke down before reaching the front. The crew barely escaped as the engine burst into flames. The smell of burnt rubber mixed with the sound of desert wind. That was the moment Carter decided. If nobody else would fix it, he would. But it wouldn't be easy. The army didn't need heroes, it needed obedience. Mechanics followed orders, not instincts. If anyone saw what he planned, they could shut him down before he even started. Yet in war, silence hides revolutions. That night, under a torn canvas tent, Carter began collecting scraps. Old pipes from wrecked trucks, fan blades, torn sheets of metal. The others thought he was just repairing a damaged engine. He didn't tell them the truth. He wasn't repairing it. He was redesigning it. Outside, the desert was quiet except for the distant rumble of tanks preparing for another hopeless run. Inside his tent, Carter traced his finger through a thin layer of sand, sketching the shape of a new airflow system. The idea was forming. Simple, dangerous, brilliant. He would redirect the heat away, not trap it inside. He worked through the night, sweat dripping onto the sand as his hands moved with purpose. Every sound outside reminded him how close he was to being caught. But fear didn't matter anymore. Every burnt-out tank was a reminder of what happened when people followed the rules too perfectly. By dawn, his eyes were bloodshot, his uniform soaked. But he had something no one else did, a plan. He looked out toward the dunes, where the sun was beginning to rise again like a slow, merciless god. Tomorrow, it would scorch another 100 tanks to death. Unless he stopped it. The desert had already killed steel. But it hadn't yet met Raymond Carter. The desert was still asleep when Raymond Carter woke, his mind burning hotter than the sun soon would. Around him, the camp was silent. Only the sound of the wind scraping across metal and the distant growl of engines trying to live another day. He glanced toward the line of broken Shermans, half buried in sand, their hulls shimmering in dawn's weak light. Each one was a monument to failure. But inside that silence, he carried a secret no one else knew. He had an idea. A dangerous one. All through the night, Carter had sketched diagrams into the sand floor of his tent. Loops, arrows, lines, his mind tracing every inch of the Sherman's engine system. He had seen aircraft engines use something similar. A trick that forced air to circulate more efficiently under heat stress. But in a tank, buried under tons of armor, that kind of airflow was considered impossible. It wasn't in the manual, and in war, if it wasn't in the manual, it didn't exist. Yet Carter couldn't stop seeing it. Airflow not as a problem, but as the answer. When the sun rose, he was already scavenging. He stripped broken trucks for pipes, cut apart useless air ducts, and dug through scrap piles for fan blades that still worked. Each sound of metal hitting metal risked drawing attention. If any officer caught him dismantling equipment without orders, it wouldn't be a lecture, it would be charges. But he couldn't care. The desert didn't care for permission either. By mid-morning, a few mechanics noticed. "Carter, what the hell are you doing?" one of them asked, sweat streaking his face. "We're supposed to fix tanks, not invent new ones." Carter didn't look up. "I'm fixing the reason they die." "You'll get court-martialed for this," another warned. "Maybe," Carter said quietly. "But if I don't, we'll all be buried under these things before the week's done." They left him alone after that. Some out of fear, others out of curiosity. Nobody believed he'd actually succeed. The day grew hotter. His uniform clung to his skin, soaked through with sweat and oil. His fingers blistered from welding in the open heat. He cut, bolted, and reshaped whatever he could find, rerouting airflow from the tank's rear vents toward a system of redirected ducts, angled in a way that should pull cooler air from beneath and push hot air out through a modified fan housing. It was crude, ugly, and completely unauthorized. But it was his. By late afternoon, his creation stood ready, half mechanical Frankenstein, half miracle. The tank crew assigned to it stared at him in disbelief. "You're gonna blow us all up, Carter," one of them muttered. "Maybe," Carter said, climbing into the driver's seat. "But if I don't, you'll still be roasting before sundown." He turned the ignition. The engine coughed, roared, and immediately filled the air with a blast of dust and sand. Everyone nearby shouted and covered their eyes. The airflow ripped through the ground like a storm, kicking up dirt in every direction. Carter grinned for half a second, until the roar faded, sputtered, and died. Silence. Then came the voices. "What the hell did you do? Shut it down before it catches fire." Carter slammed the hatch shut, fists shaking. It had almost worked. Almost. But something was wrong. The flow was there, too strong, too violent, but the pressure balance wasn't right. The engine couldn't breathe evenly. That night, under the same weak lantern he'd used before, he took apart his own work. He lay in the sand, staring up at the stars, thinking about how close he'd come. He could almost hear the desert laughing, mocking him for thinking he could outsmart it. Maybe the officers were right. Maybe you couldn't rewrite an entire machine's design from a tent in the middle of nowhere. But then, as he cleaned the ducts, his hand brushed against the fan assembly. It was mounted backwards, the angle reversed from how he'd drawn it. The air wasn't wrong. The direction was. He sat up, heart pounding. It wasn't failure, it was a sign. By dawn, before anyone else was awake, he crawled back into the tank. The metal burned his palms even before the sun was high. He reversed the fan's orientation, adjusted the angle of the ductwork, and tightened the seals with strips of leather cut from old boots. Sweat poured down his face, stinging his eyes. Then, with one deep breath, he turned the key again. The engine hesitated, then came alive. Smooth. Clean. The air rushing out was hot but constant. For the first time, the temperature gauge didn't climb. It held steady. 10 minutes. 20. 45. The tank stayed cool. The sound of steady combustion filled the desert, deep and even, like a heartbeat. Carter climbed out, his face lit with disbelief. Mechanics gathered, whispering. "That's impossible," one said. "It should have blown." "It didn't," Carter replied. "It's breathing." Word spread fast. Officers arrived within the hour, furious at first. The air around Carter grew tense as they demanded explanations. Unauthorized modifications, risk of explosion, violation of Army regulations. He'd broken half the rulebook in one day. But then they saw the readings. The modified tank had run for over 2 hours straight, at desert noon, with its temperature staying well below critical. Every other tank in the field would have overheated in half that time. The commanding officer's tone shifted from anger to disbelief. "You did this yourself?" Carter nodded, eyes fixed on the data gauge. "It's just air, sir. We were trapping it instead of using it." There was a long silence. Then the officer said quietly, "Do it again. I want to see it run." They tested it all day. The tank performed like no other. It didn't slow down, didn't boil over, didn't die. For the first time since landing in Africa, the desert lost. But the success came with a price. Official engineers, flown in days later, weren't pleased. They examined Carter's design with cold expressions, exchanging whispers behind clipboards. Some called it reckless improvisation, others unauthorized experimentation. One muttered, "If this works, it'll make us all look like fools." Carter stood silently as they argued over his head. He didn't care about credit or punishment. All he wanted was for the tanks to survive. Eventually, word reached higher command. The report came back stamped, under review. No recognition. No medal. Just a quiet order. Continue limited field testing under supervision. But even that was enough. Because soon, a single line of modified tanks, just a handful, were selected for the next offensive. One of them was Carter's. His idea would face its first real test, not in the garage, not under supervision, but in battle. If it worked, it could change the campaign. If it failed, it would burn before the first shot fired. Carter looked out across the desert that evening as the sun sank low and the air cooled to a whisper. Around him, engines rumbled faintly in the dark. Tomorrow, one of them would carry his fingerprints into war. He wiped his hands on a rag and looked up at the horizon. The desert had taken enough lives. Tomorrow, it would meet something that refused to die. The desert had gone silent before dawn. Rows of tanks sat motionless under the gray light, their metal hulls glistening with a thin layer of dew, like the desert was giving them one last blessing before the heat returned. Somewhere among them sat one tank that was different, one machine carrying an unapproved secret hidden beneath its armor. The men who rode it didn't know if it would survive the day, but they knew it breathed differently than the rest. Inside its belly was the mechanic's forbidden idea, the airflow system Raymond Carter had built from scraps and stubbornness. He stood beside the tank, hands black with oil, eyes fixed on the horizon where the faint glow of artillery flares blinked like lightning. Around him, the camp stirred to life. Soldiers checked weapons, mechanics kicked treads, and officers barked orders that disappeared into the wind. The Second Battle of El Alamein was about to begin, the fight that would decide who controlled North Africa. For weeks, Carter's modification had remained a rumor. Mechanics whispered about a cool-running tank that never broke down, about a Kansas boy who'd tricked the desert itself. Some called it luck, others called it blasphemy against the rulebook. But this morning, nobody cared about rules. They just wanted to make it home alive. Carter climbed onto the tank, brushing sand off the turret. The crew greeted him with weary smiles. They'd seen what his design could do in tests. Now, they were about to see if it could survive war. "Still think it'll hold?" the gunner asked. Carter looked at the horizon. "We'll find out soon enough." At 6 a.m., the first shells screamed through the air. The desert came alive with thunder. The horizon flashed orange as British and American forces launched a massive assault against Rommel's fortified lines. Tanks roared forward, treads grinding against sand and stone. Carter's modified Sherman lurched into motion, the engine humming low and steady, a different kind of sound, deeper, calmer, confident. Within minutes, chaos swallowed the field. The air filled with smoke, dust, and the acrid scent of burning fuel. Overhead, planes dove and climbed, scattering fire across the dunes. Through the haze, Carter watched as one Sherman after another began to falter, their engines choking, their power fading under the brutal heat. Inside his tank, the temperature gauge remained steady. The airflow system hissed softly, cycling hot air out through the reworked ducts. The metal floor stayed warm but bearable. It was working. "Temperature holding," the driver shouted, eyes wide with disbelief. "Keep pushing," Carter replied, gripping the turret rail. "Don't stop for anything." They advanced faster than any other tank in their formation. Where others slowed to avoid overheating, Carter's Sherman tore forward, its treads carving through soft sand. The crew could feel the difference. It wasn't just surviving the desert, it was defying it. The radio crackled with panicked voices. "Unit 3 down, engine failure. Cooling system compromised. We're overheating, falling back." Carter listened in silence. Around them, smoke rose from crippled machines, some already burning. Yet their own engine stayed cool, its pulse steady beneath their feet. Then came the real test. As they neared the front line, a burst of German fire struck nearby. Shells slammed into the sand, sending waves of heat and dust into the air. One fragment tore through their side armor, shaking the tank violently. The gunner cursed, the driver fought to steady the wheel, but the engine kept roaring, unbroken, unwavering. "Still alive?" the driver shouted. "Then let's make it count," Carter said. Hours passed like minutes. The battlefield boiled with sound. Gunfire, metal grinding, men shouting. Carter barely noticed the heat anymore. All he could think about was the hum of his creation beneath him, the proof that his madness had worked. By midday, the tide had turned. The enemy lines began to break. The once invincible Desert Fox was retreating. And somewhere in that chaos, Carter's modified tank, his illegal experiment, stood at the heart of victory. When the battle ended, the field was a wasteland of twisted steel and smoldering wreckage. Carter climbed out of the tank, his uniform blackened, his throat raw from sand and smoke. He looked around at the shattered horizon. Dozens of tanks lay destroyed, but not his. His still idled calmly, engine cool, the ducts breathing softly like a living thing. A colonel approached, dust covering his cap. "Is this the one?" he asked, gesturing to the machine. Carter nodded. "Yes, sir." The colonel circled the tank slowly, running a hand over the scarred armor. "You realize you broke about a dozen regulations?" "Yes, sir," Carter said. The colonel paused, then smiled faintly. "Good thing you did." That was the last official conversation about it. There were no medals, no headlines, no commendations. But over the following weeks, more and more tanks began to appear with quiet, unrecorded modifications. Airflow ducts just a little wider, fan assemblies angled just a little differently. Nobody mentioned who started it. The army didn't need to say it out loud. They knew. The change spread across the desert faster than the news itself. Tanks lasted longer, engines ran cooler, and breakdowns dropped sharply. Soldiers joked that someone must have bribed the sun. But in a small corner of the camp, Carter kept to himself, wiping grease from his hands, pretending he'd done nothing special. He wasn't looking for fame. He was looking for survival. Weeks later, when the campaign ended and the Allies declared victory in North Africa, Carter was reassigned to a new unit. The paperwork listed him as Maintenance Specialist, 3rd Armored Division. Nothing more. No mention of the idea that had helped turn the tide. On his last night before transfer, he walked out to the dunes. The desert stretched endless and quiet, the wind whispering across the sand like an old memory. He knelt beside his tank, the same machine that had carried him through hell, and rested a hand on its metal hull. It was cool to the touch, even under the dying sun. He smiled faintly. "We did it," he whispered. Then he stood, turned, and walked away. Years later, engineers would design new cooling systems based on improved airflow optimization, never realizing the first version had been born in a tent, built by a mechanic with no orders and no permission. Carter's name never appeared in any report. But every time a tank rolled through a desert without overheating, his fingerprints were there, hidden in the wind that kept those engines alive. Because one man had dared to listen, not to the rulebook, but to the desert itself. The war moved on. The world forgot. But the desert didn't. Somewhere, in the silence after sunset, it still remembered the day steel learned how to breathe.